The mystery of consciousness. Investigating the nature of consciousness itself and transforming its contents through deliberate training is the basis of spiritual life. In scientific terms, however, consciousness remains notoriously difficult to understand or even to define. In fact, many debates about its character have been waged without the participants finding even a common topic as common ground. While we need not recapitulate the history of our confusion on this point, it will be useful to briefly examine why consciousness still poses a unique challenge to science. Having done so, we will see that spirituality is not just important for living a good life, it is actually essential for understanding the human mind. In one of the most influential essays on consciousness ever written, the philosopher Thomas Nagel asks us to consider what it is like to be a bat. His interest isn't in bats, but in how we define the concept of consciousness. Nagel argues that an organism is conscious, quote, if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something that it is like for the organism, end quote. Whether you find that statement brilliant, trivial, or merely perplexing, probably says a lot about your appetite for philosophy. Brilliant and trivial can both be defended, but Nagel's claim needn't leave you confused. He's simply asking you to imagine trading places with a bat. If you would be left with any experience, however indescribable, some spectrum of sights, sounds, sensations, feelings, that is what consciousness is in the case of a bat. If being transformed into a bat were tantamount to annihilation, however, then bats are not conscious. Nagel's point is that whatever else consciousness may or may not entail in physical terms, the difference between it and unconsciousness is a matter of subjective experience. Either the lights are on, or they are not. But experience is one thing, and our growing scientific picture of reality is another. At this moment, you might be vividly aware of listening to this book, but you are completely unaware of the electrochemical events occurring at each of the trillions of synapses in your brain. However much you may know about physics, chemistry, and biology, you live elsewhere. As a matter of your experience, you are not a body of atoms, molecules, and cells. You are consciousness and its ever-changing contents, passing through various stages of wakefulness and sleep, from cradle to grave. And the question of how consciousness relates to the physical world remains famously unresolved. There are reasons to believe that it emerges on the basis of information processing in complex systems like a human brain, because when we look at the universe, we find it filled with simpler structures, like stars, and processes, like nuclear fusion, that offer no outward sign of consciousness. But our intuitions here may not amount to much. After all, how would the sun appear if it were conscious? Perhaps exactly as it does now. Would you expect it to talk? And yet somehow it seems far less likely that stars are conscious and simply mute than that they lack inner lives altogether. Whatever the ultimate relationship between consciousness and matter, almost everyone will agree that at some point in the development of complex organisms like ourselves, consciousness seems to emerge. This emergence does not depend upon a change of materials, for you and I are built of the same atoms as a fern or a ham sandwich. Instead, the birth of consciousness must be the result of organization. Arranging atoms in certain ways appears to bring about an experience of being that very collection of atoms. This is undoubtedly one of the deepest mysteries given to us to contemplate. Nevertheless, Nagel was right to observe that the reality of consciousness is, first and foremost, subjective, for it is simply the fact of subjectivity itself. And whether something seems conscious from the outside is never quite the point. I happen to know a person who once woke up during a surgery for which he had received a general anesthetic. Owing to the paralytic component of the anesthesia, however, he was unable to signal to his doctors that he was awake and feeling rather more of the procedure than he liked. This was inconvenient, to say the least, because they were in the process of replacing his liver. If you think that the important part of consciousness is its link to speech and behavior, spare a moment to consider the problem of anesthesia awareness. It is a cure for much bad philosophy. It is surely a sign of intellectual progress that a discussion of consciousness need no longer begin with a debate about its existence. To say that consciousness may only seem to exist from the inside is to admit its existence in full. For if things seem any way at all, that is consciousness. Even if I happen to be a brain in a vat at this moment, all my memories are false, and all my perceptions are of a world that does not exist. The fact that I am having an experience is indisputable, to me at least. This is all that is required for me or any other sentient being to fully establish the reality of consciousness. Consciousness is the one thing in this universe that cannot be an illusion. As our understanding of the physical world has evolved, our notion of what counts as physical has broadened considerably. A world teeming with fields and forces, vacuum fluctuations, and the other gossamer spawn of modern physics is not the physical world of common sense. In fact, our common sense seems to be stuck somewhere in the 16th century. It has also been generally forgotten that many of the patriarchs of physics in the first half of the 20th century regularly impugned the physicality of the universe and placed mind or thoughts or consciousness itself at the very wellspring of reality. Non-reductive views like those of Arthur Eddington, James Jeans, Wolfgang Pauli, Werner Heisenberg, and Erwin Schrödinger seem to have had no lasting impact. In some ways we can be thankful for this, for a fair amount of mumbo-jumbo was in the air. Pauli, for instance, was a devotee of Carl Jung, who apparently analyzed no fewer than 1,300 of the great man's dreams. Although Pauli was one of the titans of physics, his thoughts about the irreducibility of mind probably had as much to do with Jung's febrile imagination as they did with quantum mechanics. The allure of the numinous eventually subsided. Once physicists got down to the serious business of building bombs, we were apparently returned to a universe of objects and to a style of discourse across all branches of science and philosophy that made the mind seem ripe for reduction to the, quote, physical world. These developments have greatly inconvenienced New Age thinkers, or would have had they deigned to notice them. Authors struggling to link spirituality to science generally pin their hopes on misunderstandings of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which they take as proof that consciousness plays a central role in determining the character of the physical world. If nothing is real until it is observed, consciousness cannot arise from electrochemical events in the brains of animals like ourselves. Rather, it must be part of the very fabric of reality. But this simply isn't the position of mainstream physics. It is true that according to Copenhagen, quantum mechanical systems do not behave classically until they are observed, and before that, they may seem to exist in many different states simultaneously. But what counts as an observation under the original Copenhagen view was never clearly defined. The notion has been refined since, and it has nothing to do with consciousness. It's not that the mysteries of quantum mechanics have been resolved. The physical picture is strange however one looks at it. And the problem of how an underlying quantum mechanical reality becomes the seemingly classical world of tables and chairs hasn't been completely understood. However, there is no reason to think that consciousness is integral to the process. It seems certain, therefore, that anyone who would base his spirituality on misinterpretations of 1930s physics is bound to be disappointed. As we will see, the link between spirituality and science must be found in another place. We know, of course, that human minds are the product of human brains. There is simply no question that your ability to decode and understand this sentence depends upon neurophysiological events taking place inside your head at this moment. But most of this mental work occurs entirely in the dark, and it is a mystery why any part of the process should be attended by consciousness. Nothing about a brain, when surveyed as a physical system, suggests that it is a locus of experience. Were we not already brimming with consciousness ourselves, we would find no evidence for it in the universe, nor would we have any notion of the many experiential states that it gives rise to. The only proof that it is like something to be you at this moment is the fact, obvious only to you, that it is like something to be you. However we propose to explain the emergence of consciousness, be it in biological, functional, computational, or any other terms, we have committed ourselves to this much. First, there is a physical world, unconscious and seething with unperceived events. Then, by virtue of some physical property or process, consciousness itself springs or staggers into being. This idea seems to me not merely strange, but perfectly mysterious. That doesn't mean it isn't true. When we linger over the details, however, this notion of emergence seems merely a placeholder for a miracle. Consciousness, the sheer fact that this universe is illuminated by sentience, is precisely what unconsciousness is not. And I believe that no description of unconscious complexity will fully account for it. To simply assert that consciousness arose at some point in the evolution of life, and that it results from a specific arrangement of neurons firing in concert within an individual brain, doesn't give us any inkling of how it could emerge from unconscious processes, even in principle. However, this is not to say that some other thesis about consciousness must be true. Consciousness may very well be the lawful product of unconscious information processing. But I don't know what that sentence actually means, and I don't think anyone else does either. This situation has been characterized as an explanatory gap and as the hard problem of consciousness, and it is surely both. Some philosophers have suggested that the relationship between mind and body will be understood only with reference to concepts that are neither physical nor mental, but are in some sense neutral. Others claim that consciousness can be known to be the product of physical causes, but cannot be conceptually reduced to such causes. Still others have argued that the notion of a non-reductive physical account is incoherent. I am sympathetic with those who, like the philosopher Colin McGinn and the psychologist Steven Pinker, have suggested that perhaps the emergence of consciousness is simply incomprehensible in human terms. Every chain of explanation must end somewhere, generally with a brute fact that neglects to explain itself. Perhaps consciousness presents an impasse of this sort. In any case, the task of explaining consciousness in physical terms bears little resemblance to other successful explanations in the history of science. The analogies that scientists and philosophers marshal here are invariably misleading. The fact, for instance, that we can now describe properties of matter, such as fluidity, in terms of microscopic events that are not themselves fluid, does not suggest a way to understand consciousness as an emergent property of the unconscious world. It is easy to see that no single water molecule can be fluid, and it is easy to see that billions of such molecules, freely sliding past one another, would appear as fluidity on the scale of a human hand. What is not easy to see is how analogies of this kind have persuaded so many people that consciousness can be readily explained in terms of information processing. For an explanation of a phenomenon to be satisfying, it must first be, at minimum, intelligible. In this regard, the emergence of fluidity poses no problems. The free sliding of molecules seems exactly the sort of thing that should be true of a substance to ensure its fluidity. Why can I pass my hand through liquid water and not through rock? Because the molecules of water are not bound so tightly as to resist my motion. Notice that this explanation of fluidity is perfectly reductive. Fluidity really is nothing but the free motion of molecules. For this explanation to be sufficient, we must first admit that molecules exist, of course, but once we do, the problem is solved. No one has described a set of unconscious events whose sufficiency as a cause of consciousness would make sense in this way. Any attempt to understand consciousness in terms of brain activity merely correlates a person's ability to report an experience, demonstrating that he was aware of it, with specific states of his brain. While such correlations can amount to fascinating neuroscience, they bring us no closer to explaining the emergence of consciousness itself. There will almost certainly come a time when we will build a robot whose facial expressiveness, tone of voice, and flexibility of thought will cause us to wonder whether or not it is conscious. This robot might even claim to be conscious and be eager to participate in the kinds of experiments we now perform on human beings, allowing us to correlate its responses to stimuli with changes in its brain. It seems clear, however, that unless we can do more than this, we will never know whether there is something that it is like to be such a machine. Some listeners may think I've stacked the deck against the sciences of mind by comparing consciousness to a phenomenon so easily understood as fluidity. Surely science has dispelled far greater mysteries. What, for instance, is the difference between a living system and a dead one? Insofar as questions about consciousness itself can be kept off the table, it seems that the difference is now reasonably clear to us. And yet as late as 1932, the Scottish physiologist J.S. Haldane, father of J.B.S. Haldane, wrote the following: "What intelligible account can the mechanistic theory of life give of the recovery from disease and injuries? Simply none at all, except that these phenomena are so complex and strange that as yet we cannot understand them. It is exactly the same with the closely related phenomena of reproduction. We cannot by any stretch of the imagination conceive a delicate and complex mechanism which is capable, like a living organism, of reproducing itself indefinitely often." Scarcely 20 years passed before our imaginations were duly stretched. Much work in biology remains to be done, but anyone who entertains vitalism at this point is simply ignorant about the nature of living systems. The jury is no longer out on questions of this kind, and more than half a century has passed since the Earth's creatures required an élan vital to propagate themselves or to recover from injury. It is my skepticism that we will arrive at a physical explanation of consciousness analogous to Haldane's doubt about the feasibility of explaining life in terms of processes that are not themselves alive. It wouldn't seem so. To say that a system is alive is very much like saying that it is fluid, because life is a matter of what systems do with respect to their environment. Like fluidity, life is defined according to external criteria. Consciousness is not, and I think cannot be. We would never have occasion to say of something that does not eat, excrete, grow, or reproduce that it might be alive. It might, however, be conscious. Might a mature neuroscience nevertheless offer a proper explanation of consciousness in terms of its underlying brain processes? Again, there is nothing about a brain, studied at any scale, that even suggests that it might harbor consciousness, apart from the fact that we experience consciousness directly and have correlated many of its contents, or lack thereof, with processes in our brains. Nothing about human behavior, or language, or culture demonstrates that it is mediated by consciousness, apart from the fact that we simply know that it is, a truth that someone can appreciate in himself directly and in others by analogy. Here is where the distinction between studying consciousness itself and studying its contents becomes paramount. It is easy to see that the contents of consciousness might be understood in neurophysiological terms. Consider, for instance, our experience of seeing an object. Its color, contours, apparent motion, and location in space arise in consciousness as a seamless unity, even though this information is processed by many separate systems in the brain. Thus, when a golfer prepares to hit a shot, he does not first see the ball's roundness, then its whiteness, and only then its position on the tee. Rather, he enjoys a unified perception of the ball. Many neuroscientists believe that this phenomenon of, quote, binding can be explained by disparate groups of neurons firing in synchrony. Whether or not this theory is true, it is at least intelligible, because synchronous activity seems just the sort of thing that could explain the unity of a percept. This work suggests, as many other findings in neuroscience do, that the contents of consciousness can often be made sense of in terms of their underlying neurophysiology. However, when we ask why such phenomena should be experienced in the first place, we are returned to the mystery of consciousness in full. Unfortunately, efforts to locate consciousness in the brain generally fail to distinguish between consciousness and its contents. As a result, many researchers have taken one form of consciousness, or one class of its contents, as a sufficient view of the whole. For instance, Christoph Koch and others have done some very clever work on vision, looking for which regions of the brain encode conscious visual perception. The phenomenon of binocular rivalry has provided an especially useful foothold here. It just so happens that when each eye is presented with a different visual stimulus, a person's conscious experience is not a blending of the two images, but rather a series of apparently random transitions between them. If, for instance, you are shown a picture of a house in one eye and a human face in the other, you will not see the two images competing with each other or otherwise superimposed. You will see the house for a few seconds, and then the face, and then the house again, switching at random intervals. This phenomenon has allowed experimenters to look for those regions of the brain in both humans and monkeys that respond to a change in conscious perception. The psychophysical situation seems tailor-made to distinguish the frontier between conscious and unconscious components of vision. Because the input remains constant, each eye receives the continuous impression of a single image, while somewhere in the brain, a wholesale change in the contents of consciousness occurs every few seconds. This is very interesting, and yet subjects experiencing binocular rivalry are conscious throughout the experiment. Only the contents of visual awareness have been modulated by the task. If you shut your eyes at this moment, the contents of your consciousness change quite drastically, but your consciousness, arguably, does not. This is not to say that our understanding of the mind won't change in surprising ways through our study of the brain. There may be no limit to how a maturing neuroscience might reshape our beliefs about the nature of conscious experience. Are we unconscious during sleep or merely unable to remember what sleep is like? Can human minds be duplicated? Neuroscience may one day answer such questions, and the answers might well surprise us. But the reality of consciousness appears irreducible. Only consciousness can know itself, and directly through first-person experience. It follows, therefore, that rigorous introspection, spirituality in the widest sense of the term, is an indispensable part of understanding the nature of the mind.